Okay, so I want to start today with something that is happening right now. Not in the daily news cycle about who is hitting what, but in Iran's parliament. And I want to explain why what is happening in that parliament building is more significant for the long term than almost anything else in this entire situation. Iran is currently drafting legislation to make permanent its system of charging fees for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Let me be precise about what that means. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow gap of water, only 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, through which approximately 20% of all the oil traded in the entire world passes every single day. This is the waterway that has been at the center of everything we have been discussing on this channel. The leverage, the checkpoint, the yuan payments, the $2 million per tanker. Until now, that system was a wartime measure, a response to the conflict, something that existed because of the current situation and could, in theory, disappear when the situation ended. Iran is now turning it into law, and Iran's foreign minister stated publicly this week, with complete clarity, what that law means. The strait, he said, will not be the same as it was before. Iran has rewritten the maritime rules. The decision to grant a transit permit to a ship rests solely with Iran, not with international maritime law, not with the United Nations, not with any existing framework that governed how the strait worked before any of this began. With Iran, solely, permanently, written into domestic legislation. And Pakistan's defense minister, one of the countries mediating the current negotiations, described the entire situation in one sentence that cuts through everything else being said. He noted that it seems the goal of the current situation has shifted to opening the Strait of Hormuz, which was already open before any of this began. So today I want to explain what this law actually means, not for the current situation, not for the negotiations happening right now, but for the next 50 years, for the global energy system, for the countries that depend on that waterway, and for the ordinary people whose lives connect to what happens in that 33-kilometer gap, even if they have never heard of it. Because once you understand what this law is doing, you will see the entire conflict in a completely different way. I have covered the Strait of Hormuz across multiple videos on this channel, but today I want to go deeper on one specific aspect that most coverage has not fully addressed. Not the tactical situation, who is passing through, who is paying, but the legal and structural significance of what Iran is now doing. For the past several decades, the Strait of Hormuz has operated under a framework of international maritime law. The basic principle of that framework is that straits connecting international waters are open to navigation by all countries. No single country owns them. No single country can charge for passage or decide who gets through based on political alignment. This framework, called innocent passage, has been the legal foundation of global trade for generations. It is why ships from every country in the world could pass through the strait without asking Iran's permission. It is why the global energy system could function with the predictability that economies need. And it is why the strait, for all its geographic sensitivity, was considered a reliable part of the infrastructure of global commerce rather than a choke point controlled by a single state. Iran is now legislating the end of that framework, not informally, not as a wartime emergency measure, as permanent domestic law, a law that says passage requires a permit, a law that says the permit is granted or denied at Iran's sole discretion, a law that says ships pay fees for that permission. Now here is why this matters in a way that goes far beyond the current situation. Laws are much harder to undo than policies. When a government implements a policy, even a significant one, it can reverse it through negotiation, through pressure, through a change in the political climate. But when a government passes a law, reversing it requires going through its own legislative process. It requires domestic political will to change something that has been formally established. It becomes part of the country's legal architecture in a way that creates institutional momentum toward maintaining it. Iran is not just using the strait as leverage in the current conflict. It is institutionalizing that leverage. It is building the legal framework that will allow it to maintain this position regardless of how the current situation ends, regardless of what any ceasefire agreement says, regardless of what international pressure follows. And that is a completely different and far more significant development than anything else happening in this conflict right now. To understand why Iran is doing this and why it is doing it now, you need to go back to something we covered in the trap video several weeks ago. Iran did not improvise its position in this conflict. It spent approximately 50 years deliberately building a strategic situation where any major confrontation with America would result in Iran having more leverage at the end than at the beginning. Not because Iran expected to win militarily, but because Iran understood something about the nature of leverage that its adversaries consistently underestimated. Leverage does not come from having the most powerful force. Leverage comes from controlling something the other side cannot function without. And the Strait of Hormuz, the gap through which 20% of global daily oil supply passes, is something the global economy cannot function without. Iran has known this for 50 years. It has built its entire strategic doctrine around that one geographic fact. Every decision about how to develop its response capabilities, its regional network, its economic resilience under pressure, all of it was oriented around the eventual moment when its control over the strait could be fully demonstrated and then institutionalized. That moment is now. The current conflict did not weaken Iran's strait position. It validated it. It proved to every country on earth that the position is real, that it functions under maximum pressure, and that it produces the outcomes Iran always said it would produce. Countries paid in yuan. Countries stayed neutral to protect their energy access. Countries that tried to force the strait open discovered the cost was higher than they were willing to pay. And now, having demonstrated the position under pressure, Iran is converting the demonstration into permanent law. It is taking the leverage that was validated in this conflict and encoding it into an institutional framework that will outlast any individual agreement, any political change in Tehran, any future diplomatic development. This is strategic patience operating on its longest timescale. Not just building a position over 50 years, but using a specific confrontation to permanently establish that position in a way that cannot easily be undone. Here's what I want to ask you before we continue. When you think about the long-term consequences of this conflict, not what happens in the next few weeks, but what the world looks like in 10 years, do you think the straight toll law will still be in place? Tell me in the comments. Because I think how people answer that question tells you a great deal about how clearly they see what is actually happening here. Now let me connect this to something we have been building toward across multiple videos. Because the straight toll law is not just an energy story, it is a financial story. And the financial implications are considerably larger than most coverage acknowledges. We covered the petrodollar system in an earlier video. The arrangement where Gulf oil is priced and sold in US dollars, an arrangement that has been in place since 1974, is one of the most important structural foundations of American financial power. Because oil is priced in dollars, every country on earth needs dollars to buy energy. That constant global demand for dollars keeps the dollar strong, keeps American borrowing costs low, and keeps the global financial system oriented around American financial institutions. The straight toll law challenges that system in a specific and structural way. If Iran controls who passes through the strait and under what conditions, and if Iran can and does require payment in currencies other than dollars, as it has been doing throughout this conflict, then the relationship between energy access and dollar demand starts to change. Countries that need to pay Iran for straight access in yuan are building yuan reserves. Countries that are redirecting energy trade through Iran-controlled channels are building relationships with financial systems that operate outside the dollar framework. This does not happen overnight, and it does not mean the dollar collapses tomorrow. The dollar's position in the global financial system has enormous institutional momentum and is not easily displaced. But direction of travel matters. And what the straight toll law does is establish a permanent institutional mechanism that consistently pushes energy trade in a direction that reduces dollar dependence. Not because of any single transaction, but because the law creates an ongoing structure that day by day, voyage by voyage, makes non-dollar settlement of energy trade more normalized. The petrodollar system was built on an agreement in 1974 between America and Saudi Arabia. It has persisted for 50 years because no credible alternative existed and because the countries most affected by it lacked the leverage to challenge it. Iran just created a credible mechanism for challenging it, not in a single dramatic moment. In a piece of domestic legislation that turns the world's most important energy choke point into an ongoing source of pressure on the dollar's role in global energy trade. Now let me bring this all the way down to the level that matters most for the people watching this video, because the Strait Toll Law is a structural and legal development, but its consequences are not abstract. They land on ordinary people in very specific and very practical ways. Think about what a permanent Iranian toll on Strait passage means for global energy prices over the next decade. Every tanker that passes through pays. That cost gets added to the price of every barrel of oil that travels that route. Those costs travel through supply chains the same way all energy costs do. To refineries, to distributors, to fuel stations, to the ordinary family filling their tank or paying their heating bill. This is not a temporary disruption that ends when a ceasefire is signed. This is a permanent structural addition to the cost of moving energy through the most important choke point in the world, a cost that did not exist before this conflict began, a cost that will exist long after the current situation is resolved, and a cost that will be paid not by governments or by the people who made the decisions that produced it, but by the ordinary people at the end of the supply chain who have no influence over the decisions that created it. And beyond the direct cost, there is the uncertainty. The Strait Toll Law does not just add a fee, it transforms the strait from a reliable, rule-governed international waterway into a discretionary system where Iran decides who passes and under what conditions. That discretion introduces uncertainty into every energy supply chain that depends on Gulf oil. And uncertainty has its own cost. In the insurance premiums that shipping companies pay, in the risk adjustments that energy companies build into their pricing, in the strategic calculations that governments make about their energy security and independence. Before this conflict, the Strait was a geographic risk that was managed through international maritime law and American security guarantees. After this conflict, the Strait is a geopolitically administered system controlled by Iran and governed by Iranian domestic legislation. That shift from international legal framework to Iranian domestic law is the most significant structural change in the global energy system in 50 years. And it happened not because Iran forced it through in a single dramatic confrontation. It happened because a conflict that was supposed to weaken Iran's strategic position instead validated and institutionalized it. Pakistan's defense minister captured it perfectly. The goal seems to have shifted to opening the strait, which was already open before any of this began. The opening was free. Now it is governed by Iranian law and subject to Iranian fees. And that change is now being written permanently into the legal architecture of the global energy system. Here is what I want to know from you. If you are living in a country that depends on Gulf energy, and most countries do in some form, does the Strait Toll Law concern you personally? Not as geopolitics, as a practical reality that affects your energy costs, your economy, your daily life. Tell me in the comments, because I think the honest answer connects this very directly to ordinary lives in a way most coverage has not fully acknowledged. So here is what Iran's Strait Toll Law actually represents. It represents the institutionalization of leverage that was built over 50 years and validated under maximum pressure over the past several weeks. Iran did not just use the strait as a wartime tool, it used the conflict to permanently encode its control over the strait into domestic legislation, transforming a temporary wartime position into a durable legal framework that will outlast any ceasefire agreement. It represents a structural challenge to the petrodollar system that goes beyond any individual transaction or any specific diplomatic arrangement. By making the strait a permanently administered Iranian system with fees, permits, and discretionary access, Iran has created an ongoing institutional mechanism that pushes global energy trade toward non-dollar settlement every time a ship passes through. And it represents something that this channel has been tracing from the very beginning. The gap between what this conflict was supposed to achieve, weakening Iran, constraining its capabilities, reducing its leverage, and what it actually produced. The stated goal was a weaker Iran. The actual outcome is an Iran with permanent legal control over the most important energy choke point in the world. The tool that was supposed to solve the problem ended up deepening it. The pressure that was supposed to constrain Iran's leverage ended up validating and institutionalizing it. And the ordinary people who paid the cost of the distance between those two outcomes, the conflict's costs absorbed by everyday families in countries that had no say in the decisions that produced them, will continue paying a version of that cost every time a tanker transits the strait under Iran's new legal framework. The strait will not be the same as it was before. Iran Iran said that publicly, and they are now making it permanent law. Understanding that clearly, honestly, without the comfort of the official narrative, is the first step toward understanding what kind of world we are actually living in now, and what it will take to build something better. Be skeptical, look at the evidence, follow the incentives, and never stop asking how power actually works. Last question. The straight toll law is being written right now. In 10 years, do you think it will still be in place, or do you think some future development will reverse it? Tell me what you think in the comments, because the answer tells you a great deal about how permanent you believe the changes from this conflict actually are.